right, thanks, Peter. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Mami. This is a joint work with Claire and Gabriel. We all know that the tiny object on the table is probably a spoon, not an elephant. Objects do not appear in isolation. Instead, they co-vary with other objects and properties in the environment. We are interested in studying the problem of context-aware visual object recognition. Doesn't go to the next page. Okay, all right. So context plays an important role in visual recognition. Recent studies have shown that visual recognition networks can be fooled by placing objects in inconsistent context. For example, a chair in the red box is misplaced in a parking lot. We test this picture on 3 deep convolution neural nets, as shown here, and the predictor labels with their top 5 confidence levels are listed on the right. The inconsistent context tricks these neural nets into mislabeling the target chair as turnstile. However, the confidence of predicting the target as folding chair in all the 3 networks is less than 3%. Therefore, we propose a biologically plausible model to perform context-aware object recognition tasks. CRTNet is first presented with a natural image where the target object is indicated by the white bounding box. In this case, it's a cake. Inspired by the eccentricity dependence of human vision, CRTNet has one stream devoted to contextual reasoning in the periphery, and a second stream that processes only the target object. In each stream, feature maps are extracted through this weight-sharing convolution neural net. CRTNet explicitly predicts the important regions essential for contextual reasoning. It then integrates the attention modulated information in both fovea and the periphery via concatenation. CRTNet then makes the first attempt to predict a class label out of the 55 object classes in MS COCO dataset. This prediction process iterates via an LSTM over multiple time steps. CRTNet is only trained using 4 contextual natural images, and then it is tested in different contextual conditions without any retraining or fine-tuning. Expanding on the overall CRTNet architecture, here we zoom into the attention module. Since the design for object and context streams are the same, here we focus on the context stream only. The same working mechanism can be applied in the attention module of the object stream as well. So the pre-trained 2D ConvNet extracts the feature maps from the context image. Then the feature maps are applied the width by the height and by the number of channels. Thus, at each spatial location on this feature map, we would have a feature vector of dimension 1 by d, and there are total L locations. The attention module then takes as inputs the features at each location and the output of the hidden state of the LSTM module, and outputs an attention value at each spatial location. Then we can use softmax to normalize these attention values over all the spatial locations and outputs an attention map. Because not all attended regions might be useful for contextual reasoning, the soft attention module also predicts a gating vector beta from the previous hidden state, such that the beta determines how much the current observation contributes to the contextual vector at each location. Once the attention module and the gating vector are computed, the model then applies the soft attention mechanism to modulate the feature map at each location. Now let's zoom out from attention module and focus on the LSTM. Here's what we get from the previous slide, which are the attention modulated feature maps. In order to get the G's of the context, CRTNet applies the soft attention mechanism to compute Z by summing over all the L location in the image. We can then perform similar actions to get the G's of the target object. Therefore, we then concatenate both vectors and use that as the input to LSTM. The LSTM module then integrates the information with the previous step to inform the attention module to shift its attention in the next time step via the hidden state. And it also outputs the predicted class label as shown here. Do we have a question here? Okay. So therefore, let me now move on to the essential benchmarks, where we conducted a series of psychophysics experiments using MTurk. Here is our experiment schematic. Subjects were first presented with a fixation cross for 500 milliseconds, followed by a bounding box indicating the target object location for under 1 second. In most of the experiments, the image was then shown for 200 milliseconds. After the image offset, subjects type a word to identify the target object. To investigate the mechanism of contextual modulation, in addition to the full context condition, we also focus on several other fundamental aspects of context. In each experiment, we alter one aspect of a context at a time and quantified their recognition accuracy in each of these conditions. In this presentation, I will present the results on each of this. It includes size of contextual areas, blurred context, texture-only jigsaw context, as well as the incongruent context. And we also included experiments studying the temporal dynamics of contextual modulation. That is, we vary the t, which is the exposure time here. Let's now dive deeper into the experimental
I actually have a question about the previous slide, just to understand.
Sure.
So a human test subject gets an image with the plus mark in the middle for half a second.
Yep.
And then another image with the plus mark on the side. And then where that plus mark is, it gets another image where the object it needs to recognize is, right?
Exactly. That's where the target object is.
Why the first one with the half second? Why is it interesting?
Oh, it's just the typical paradigm where you want the subjects to get ready for the current trial.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you only measure like what's their classification for the object that is in the area that they should have recognized, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
All right. So yeah, in this experiment, we conjecture that the impact of contextual information would depend on the target object sizes. Thus, we constrain the size of the target objects to 4 beams, corresponding to different visual angles in degrees. They are measured by the number of pixels in the objects, regardless of their physical size in the physical world. So for each size, we introduce either a minimal context, that is the rectangular bounding box enclosing the target, or the full context condition, which is the entire image. For the minimal context condition, human performance improved monotonically as a function of target object sizes. This effect was readily captured by CRTNet as well. So now adding the full contextual information led to a large improvement in the performance, both for the humans and the CRTNet. Similar as before, we then group the stimulus based on the target object size as shown in the x-axis here. And we are interested in studying how various amounts of contextual areas influences recognition. So these are the minimal and full context conditions. And for each object size, we then systematically titrated the amount of contextual information. The CO ratio here refers to the context object ratio, that is the total image area excluding the target object divided by the target object size. We include a CO ratio from 0, that is no pixel surrounding the target at all, to 2, 4, 8, 16, and 12, 8. So here I'm showing a few examples of the same image, but with different CO ratios. Some combinations of the target object sizes and large CO ratio values might not be possible. For example, if you have a large elephant on the image, then the CO ratio is not possible for 128. For the target objects with similar size, the amount of context was important both for humans and for CRTNet. Across all the CO ratios, humans outperform the CRTNet for small object sizes, and CRTNet outperform humans for the larger object size. It's worth noting that CRTNet was never trained or fine-tuned with human psychophysics measurements, and across all the target object sizes, this experiment demonstrates that the contextual quantity can strongly influence the recognition performance.
Two questions. First, what is a large object size considered? Like an example, is it a bag in the picture? You'll say that the CRTNet will classify it better than a human?
Yes, exactly. If you are comparing so the x-axis is showing the size of the target object, and as if you are comparing this, let me try to. Is there an annotation tool here?
No, I don't know. You have, if you're using Windows, you should have an annotation tool.
Never mind. So yeah, if you're comparing size 8 of humans versus the model, it seems like the CRTNet is performed like in general, the groups of bars here is much higher than the groups of bars for humans.
When the CO ratio is lower, when there's not full context.
The opposite, when CO ratio is, yeah, that's correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so if there's less context, the machine can recognize better. We're gonna come to a question here, but before this, maybe why is there just like, what's that benchmark of giving a human just 1 second to look at the image and then classify? Why is it 1 second and not half a second or 2 seconds?
We actually, so in the next experiments, in the upcoming experiments, I'm going to show the results where we actually vary the stimulus exposure time from, instead of 200 milliseconds, we vary it from 50 milliseconds to more than 200 milliseconds.
But still sub-second, like if you give a couple of more seconds to a human.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. But typically, I think some of the works in neuroscience, like people have verified for humans, it only takes a couple of like hundreds of milliseconds to recognize the object. Like this whole thing happens very fast. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, why do you think CRTNet, based on the architecture you just demonstrated before, actually was a bit hard to follow all of it, but let's try now. Why do you think that based on the architecture, CRTNet will be predicting better results with lower context on large objects than human? Where does the advantage come for the neural net?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not exactly sure why. I think maybe it's just this weird effect where, honestly, I'm not exactly sure why that is the case. Maybe we can talk about this offline.
Yeah, sure. After the talk, if you could if you have an explanation and you can send it, I could share it also. That's okay.
Okay.
No problem.
Maybe I can add a point here. So
yeah,
go ahead.
I think surely one thing here is that as you increase the object size, the network, which you will remember, has one stream just dedicated to the target object. So as you increase the object size, you also increase like the resolution of the target object features, and that will definitely help the recognition algorithm. That being said, I think when we compare humans and machines here, we are often more interested in like the performance patterns. So are both of them benefiting from the context, and are they benefiting in the same way? To compare those absolute values is a bit tricky in some ways, because as you point out, there are quite a few ambiguities in how you design the experiment, how much time do you give them, how big or how good is the screen resolution, for example. So many of tricky things then.
Yeah, but like if you consider, first of all, of course, you can't compare apple to apple. If you compare a human to a neural net and then you say, okay, what's in the neural net is better, of course. But if you look at it from a practical point and you say, I want to build a software that can recognize objects in an image, and then you can say, oh, if we're talking about big objects, this is the software they should be building, this architecture, because it's for lower type of objects, it's not as good as a human. It's good, but not as, but for bigger types, it's even better. So this is what you should be looking at if you want for big objects. If for small objects, maybe another solution. So the question comes from this part. But yeah, I could understand if there's a bigger object, there's more features to use for the classification for the net. It makes sense.
Yep.
Another question I think we had here by Sol. Are you aware of similar context significance research done on other senses such as audio?
Yeah, that's another good question. So first we have to define what do you mean by context in terms of audio recognition here.
So while Sol is writing, maybe I will try to say, if you hear, like from my perspective, if you hear a background of a football game, so you know whatever they're being talked about is related to sports.
So I'll say that I think that, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Context in audio might be like, as you took a part of the picture here, you can take a word as a part of a sentence or a part with the background noise, as Peter mentioned.
Background noise.
For example, it's easier to recognize a word, like when I listen to a word, when it's a part of a sentence versus a single word without the context.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah. In terms of audio, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that there are lots of works in NLP, right? Natural language processing, where people have been relying on context to like for sentence generation, etc. Like there are lots of applications. I think right now, like for transformers, that's where researchers have actually used this long range connections between words in order to infer, what's the next words, etc. Yeah, I'm not sure about the audio, but yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks.
We have another question by Sudhir. You show the image for 1 sec to a human, but how do you measure and control the time CRTNet is seeing the image?
Yeah, that's another, there are lots of good questions here. So it's very hard to actually quantify. So what we did is we just simplify the problem by saying that, like in LSTM, there are different time steps, and we just say, we define like each time step is equivalent to 25 milliseconds as human exposure time. Later on, I'm just going to show you as the number of time step increases in the LSTM, the performance of CRTNet also changes. So yeah.
Can you repeat? I don't think I understood.
Okay, so we define each time step of LSTM as 25 milliseconds.
When you're saying a timestamp, you meaning like one iteration, one pass over the LSTM, or what does it mean?
Okay, so when I'm exposing CRTNet to this contextual images, and then there could be multiple time steps feedback to the LSTM, right?
Yeah. And
I'm just saying, in this work, we just define each time step that is we feed it to LSTM is equivalent to 25 milliseconds in human experiments. For example, if I'm exposing the same image to human for 200 milliseconds, that is equivalent to pass the image to the CRTNet for over 8 time steps.
By the way, why that number specifically? Is there a reason or?
No, there are no reasons. It's just the way we define it.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. So due to the strong eccentricity dependence of human vision, the periphery has less resolution than the foveal, we conjecture that the low resolution context could be sufficient to facilitate recognition. So to quantify the impact of contextual resolution, we blur the context using a zero mean Gaussian with a wide range of standard deviations. To avoid the memory effect, each human subject gets to see all the blurred condition with different images. So here is the result for humans when the target objects are very small and under this minimal context condition, the accuracy barely dropped when sigma is less than or equal to 8. And its performance levels are almost indistinguishable from the full resolution condition when sigma is less than or equal to 8 pixels. And interestingly, there was a wide range of blurring that led to the robust contextual modulation. And this is consistent with the notion that humans do not require full resolution context in order to perform recognition. The effects of blurring were also captured by CRTNet, where the contextual modulation disappeared only when using larger sigma values. So in general, similar as previous experiments, humans outperformed the CRTNet on small objects. We also compared the effect of blurring the context versus blurring the target objects by applying the same Gaussian blurring only to the target object itself. Although the number of pixels affected the blurring, target object was much smaller than blurring the context. Modifying the target object led to larger accuracy drops compared with blurring the context, as I shown in the previous slide. These are also true for all target object sizes on both humans and CRTNet. So the relative position of objects and features in an image also affects recognition. For example, we know that the sky is often at the top of the image and the grass is often at the bottom of the image. To evaluate the impact of contextual spatial configurations, we randomly scramble the image into 2x2, 4x4, or 8x8 jigsaw pieces, where the piece with the target objects remain in the same location. We did not consider cases when the object occupied more than one piece. Given the constraints, sometimes like 8x8 jigsaw pieces might not be applicable on some of the images. From the figure, we can see that humans relied on the spatial configuration of the context over all object sizes. The inconsistent spatial configuration of contextual information in the 4x4 and 8x8 configuration led to a reduction in the accuracy. But the 2x2 configuration was not different from the unscrambled full context condition, probably because each large piece already contains sufficient contextual information, and therefore contextual reasoning decreases with distance to the target. Across all the jigsaw conditions, interestingly, CRTNet was also more robust to the distorted spatial configurations. That is, the recognition accuracy differed from the full contextual conditions only for the 8x8 configuration. Again, similar analysis could be applied on the other two target object sizes. And yeah, so next we want to ask the question whether the moderately blurred context still facilitates recognition. So given the fact that the moderately blurred context still facilitates recognition, then here we asking whether low-level texture features could also enhance object recognition performance. So we constructed the textures constrained by the image statistics and pasted the in context. So if you're looking at the human side for the smaller objects, the low-level textures actually the accuracy is much lower even than the minimal context. And this is also this is slightly different than CRTNet, where we see that the low-level texture features did not facilitate object recognition for either humans or CRTNet. In fact, it is surprising to see that compared to the minimal context condition, human performance was actually slightly impaired when the objects were embedded within these textures. So CRTNet performance is, however, slightly different. And so the low-level texture features improve the recognition with respect to the minimal context only for the object size 1, but this effect was much smaller than on the larger target object sizes. Then, given that the low-level textures did not help and could even hurt recognition, we next studied recognition when objects were removed from the original image and placed in the same location but in different images with either a congruent context or incongruent context. Here, what I meant by the congruent context is that the target objects and the objects in the context belong to the same class label, and vice versa for the incongruent context. So incongruent context enhance recognition for small object sizes compared to the minimal context condition both for humans and CRTNet. Although the congruent context typically shares similar correlations between objects and the same properties, pasting the objects in a congruent context led to the weaker enhancement. So this
what is
lower,
I'm sorry, I'm just like congruent context. What is the definition again?
So the congruent context is saying that both the target object category matches with the target with so initially, for example, here I'm showing the computer mouse as the target object. The background is also coming from a background for of computers. Does it make sense?
But there's a huge drop when there's congruent context recognition.
Yes, that is correct. So okay. we are suspecting this. So one of the reasons is because once we are pasting the objects in the congruent context, we are introducing this artifact that is like this weird contrast and this artificial boundaries that we introduce into the background, which might confuse humans to misclassify it. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So yeah. So as Peter just mentioned, the congruent context typically share similar correlations, but then this lower contextual facilitation may be due to the mismatched relative size between objects and natural boundaries that we introduce during pasting. So in contrast, incongruent context consistently degraded recognition performance below the minimal context condition. Across all the object sizes, subjects showed higher accuracy for objects in incongruent versus, in the congruent versus incongruent context. Similarly, CRTNet's recognition accuracy are also positively correlated with the congruent context and was degraded by the incongruent context. Again, the results were consistent over all the object sizes. Then next, we investigated the temporal dynamics of contextual effects on recognition. So in the previous experiments, the image duration was the 200 milliseconds. Now we systematically vary t to be 50, 100, or 200 milliseconds. So human performance was largely unaffected by the image duration in both minimal context and full context conditions. As you can see here, and consistent with human behaviors, exposure time had no effect on recognition for CRTNet. Despite the short exposure time, although computation, like additional computations such as top-down or recurrent connections could take effect after the stimulus onset, here we use the backward masking technique to interrupt the computation. So backward masking did not change accuracy in the minimal context condition. However, the recognition enhancement in the full context condition was impaired when the mask was introduced after 50 to 100 milliseconds exposure. That is, if you are comparing the solid black bars versus the black bars with the highlighted yellow boundaries, there is a clear drop in the full context condition. Here I'm presenting a visualization example of the predicted attention maps at the 8th time step of the LSTM. So CRTNet takes both the context image and the target object as input, as shown here, and it predicts the correct target object label. The target object here is a baseball bat, which is very small in the original full context picture. And these are the predicted attention maps overlaid on the context and target image respectively. By observing these predicted attention maps, CRTNet seems to capture the gist of context by selectively focusing on highly correlated contextual regions. For example, the CRTNet is focusing at the locations where the baseball player or the baseball field is. And the normalized attention values are shown with the scale bar on the right. So far, we have only been focusing on CRTNet model in the experiments. We also compared CRTNet with several other computational models, which also incorporate some form of contextual information in object recognition. So first, we evaluated pre-trained VGG16 on the target object alone without any contextual information. Here are the previous human versus CRTNet performance. And here is VGG16's absolute recognition accuracy. The performance of VGG16 was essentially a chance, particularly for the small objects. Given the time limit, I'm not going to go through the absolute recognition accuracy for all the models over all the contextual conditions in all the experiments. So if you are interested, do feel free to check out our supplementary material for individual plots and analysis. Here, for simplicity, I'm only going to show you the recognition accuracy comparison between CRTNet and the comparative methods in the minimal and full context conditions. So in the paper, we also introduced another evaluation metric for evaluating the model human recognition similarity. In addition to the absolute recognition accuracy, we report the correlation values between each model and human performance across all conditions for each experiment. So here I'm showing you the table of correlation calculated based on CRTNet versus humans over all the experiments. The higher the correlations, the better, and higher correlation values indicate there are more similarities in terms of the relative changes of performance over all the conditions for the model versus humans. So VGG16 has much lower correlation than CRTNet, which suggests that context-aware object recognition task is not trivial. Like you can't basically do it with a simple feed-forward network. It indeed requires taking like useful information from the context and uses this information for recognition. Next, we probe into the question about how the target information can be represented as the input to the network. So here I'm showing the alternative approach, which is to concatenate the natural stimulus with a binary mask indicating the target object location. So now instead of 3-channel RGB channels, we are adding in this additional channel that is the binary map indicating the target location. And although the binary mask increased the performance with respect to VGG16, the accuracy was still below CRTNet. And this holds true for the correlation values as well. Knowing the target location alone is not sufficient for making use of contextual information effectively. These correlation values suggest that the tensional mechanism to weigh the different features might play an important role. We therefore implement an attention module which led to a large performance boost in both recognition accuracy and the correlation values. And these results are consistent with the previous works showing that the efficiency of attention in many vision tasks. Moreover, we also showed additional improvements in performance if we first process the context and object streams separately and then later merging these two streams for classification. Compared with the one stream case, we achieved a large performance boost in recognition, as well as higher correlation values in this case. So in the last ablation study, we integrated both attention and LSTM modules, but with only one stream. Here we are seeing a large improvement in the correlation values, although they are still slightly lower than CRTNet. Except for the ablative models, we also compared CRTNet versus two state-of-the-art models incorporating contextual information, that is in object detection, YOLO3, and semantic segmentation in deep lab. So once we get the object detection mask with the bounding boxes and the predicted label, we could perform a majority voting on all those pixels as a target location and use that predicted label as a final result. Similarly, we could perform majority voting on the predicted object segmentation mask. In terms of the correlation values, both models perform almost as well as CRTNet. In terms of the absolute recognition accuracy, which I did not show here, these models show the slightly inferior performance, especially on the small objects compared with CRTNet. One of the reasons is that they fail to efficiently incorporate contextual information, which turns out to be very helpful on small object recognition. So to summarize, object and context size matter in visual recognition, and our recognition system is robust to low resolution context and geometric rearrangement. Contextual modulation happens very fast, and it can be impaired by the rapid interruption via the background masking. We conducted a series of psychophysics experiments to quantify the human recognition accuracy, and we proposed a biologically plausible context-aware object recognition model. Across a wide range of behavioral tasks, the model approximates human-level performance without retraining for each task. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. If not, I can hand over to Philip.
Questions, anybody? I think.
Yeah. I have a question. So really great talk. I enjoyed the psychophysics experiments, especially comparing with humans. I know that's pretty difficult. My first question is that when you're drawing a comparison with humans, there's a lot of considerations. And when I see this work, we were seeing the experiments, but it seems like it was almost kind of like the tip of the iceberg in a sense. So I guess to help control some of those free variables across experiments, did you fix the, let's say, training size of the, like the training size, the amount of time you're spending with the neural net running it in runtime? Like, were you able to, how did you constrain the neural net throughout experiments?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But one point I want to emphasize is the neural nets are only trained on the four contextual images from MS Coco. It doesn't get trained or get to see all those contextual information, all those contextual conditions. So that's one point I want to emphasize. The second point is, so in terms of the temporal dynamics, during training, I'm just fixing the number of training steps for the LSTM as 8 time steps. That is equivalent to the 200 milliseconds human exposure time. And yeah, so other than that, I think there are no other controls. The training procedure is just as normal, like you train on MS Coco data set, and then you test on the validation set and make sure the performance saturates, and then you stop there. So that there is no amount of constraints. There is no constraints in terms of the number of training samples and the training time. No, but
okay. So
Yeah.
That didn't vary at all throughout all those experiments.
No, those experiments are only meant for testing CATNet. It's not being trained, like the CATNet has not been trained on any of these conditions I talked about.
So just to dig in a little bit, so you said that there's comparable, you're comparing the time steps to the actual 200 milliseconds. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So so CATNet is you imagine this is a recurrent neural net and it's LSTM, right? Then at each time step, I'm feeding the same picture to CATNet, and then it outputs a predicted label, class label. So if let's say the exposure time for human experiments is 200 milliseconds, that is like I'm feeding the same picture to CATNet 8 times. And I'm going to get 8 predicted class labels at each for over all 8 time steps, right? Does that make sense?
So it's the actual amount of time that you're running it. It's capped at 200 milliseconds.
Yeah, that's correct.
By the way, which hardware did you use?
Yeah, I was about to say.
Sorry, I took your question.
That's the next question. Is like, what hardware?
Hardware? What do you mean? Like it's just a typical GPU training. Like we fit into this. I think it's a TI 2080. Yeah.
I think there might be some confusion here. So the time constraint was for the human behavioral experiments, right? And,
I get it. Yeah.
That might be the confusion.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, we are not comparing the. Yeah, but it's yeah, it's interesting. But I wouldn't see it's. Yeah, one way of studying exposure time for the model is potentially to use like the actual yeah, but I would imagine all the like the GPU processing speed is very fast and it's probably gonna take less than 200 milliseconds. I'm not sure for 8 times that. Yeah.
I think that there's another kind of open question here about what is context. And when you think about the human in its natural setting, everything's live. There's no static images, and so when we're talking about context, it's really undefined. I think there needs to be a lot of work defining what context is. It's not just extra information. It's like, what are the qualities of that information? So my point earlier was that when there's so many things that are free variables, I think the definition of context in a natural setting, let's say even video, might be a really step forward in terms of convincing someone that there is a relevant comparison.
Yep, I agree. Yep. But we do have some sort of like indications about the quality of context, such as we blurred it, like we did lots of geometrical rearrangements, etc. Yeah, but I definitely agree. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are definitely more than that. Like, yeah.
We have Sol here. Not Sol stood here. Has a mention here. Just a thought. Congruent. I'm not sure I understand it completely, but I think it's worthwhile exploring it. Just a thought. Congruent context seems like a new and better type of adversarial training and testing method. Let's see.
Yep. So what I think I previously read an interesting paper where they did is if I'm only performing patch, like introducing patch attacks in the contextual area instead of touching the target object, what would that be? Yeah, you could follow up and then send the paper there. I think that there is an interesting point is like whether we could introduce adversarial attacks only on the contextual background without touching the target objects, and then see whether those attacks are more efficient. Yeah.
And actually, Uri has here a question which I also connect well with, if we can repeat a bit about the explanation of the architecture. Me, myself, I was browsing through it the past 20 minutes, trying to understand exactly what's happening.
Yeah. Let me just,
There are 3 slides there. There's the main one, and then there are 2 other ones.
Yeah.
And how do they connect to each other? So the second slide is the top part probably of the architecture, but the third one.
Yeah, so the third one is introducing the LSTM. So let me jump to the third. So yeah, hold on.
So we're only focusing on the contextual part, right? Like the object part, the bottom part of the architecture stays the same all the time. And
yes, exactly. So the later 2 slides are the support, like the zoom in the version of different modules in the CRTNet. So this is talking about LSTM. And the previous slide is talking about attention. Yeah, so the first slide is giving you an overview of the entire model. Yeah, I could talk a little bit more. Which part?
So let's start with the second slide, maybe. What
Sure.
does the attention vector give us, and how is it? What's like the new thing here?
It's so basically I'm doing the attention modulation, the spatial attention modulation. So in the previous works, people have studied both. That is feature, like you apply attention across the number of channels on the feature map, or you could apply attention on the spatial locations of the features, right? So here I'm calculating the attention maps for the, so as you can see here, this attention, so let's say there are the width and the height, the dimensions of the feature map. So here I'm calculating one single attention map for the over all the locations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and people have actually studied feature-based attention. That is, so instead of a W by H attention map, what people did is they calculate a 1 by D attention vector, and they apply that attention vector on the number of channels in the feature map. So I could theoretically do both, but here I'm only doing one. Yeah.
But you have a 1 by D attention vector there, and you have
Yes,
an HT.
that's
An
correct.
HT is a bias term. What is that?
For what?
HT.
Oh, that's the hidden state of LSTM, because you wanted your
That's the hidden state. Okay.
yeah, to
okay.
constantly shift its attention over time.
Yeah. And the 1 by D vector, what is this? It's not the attention vector?
No, that's a feature vector at each location. So you would have a total L feature vectors, right?
Each one is W by H. Okay,
Yeah.
so you just like straighten it out.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then you have attention value because of the stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
So once you have the attention map, what happens then?
Then it goes. So by the way, I'm also introducing this gating value at each location. That is not the contextual information at each location might not always be necessary for contextual modulation, right? So for example, if I'm saying a random person in the baseball field, it might not contribute as much as I'm saying that.
This is the construct of the LSTM. Like you changed a bit the inside of the LSTM layer. Okay.
No, this is before LSTM actually.
This is what?
This is before LSTM. I'm feeding this attention modulated feature vector to the LSTM.
Okay. So the gating values are coming from the history and the weight there.
Yep.
Okay.
That's right. So then I'm getting this attention modulated feature map, and I'm feeding this to LSTM.
Feature map attention model, that's a 1 by D, and you have L, so it's L by D. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
And then again, you're using the attention map from the previous step, and you have the gating map also from the previous step. Both of them were calculated there. And then you have a attention modulated feature map. That's, you combine all of them together. Okay.
Yes.
And then you have, what is this? What's happening then? What is that sigma and ZT there?
Sigma and Z.
Like the white circle after the concatenation of all the vectors together?
I'm not following where it. So basically, once you get to the tension modulated feature map, you have L location, right? Then you just take the mean of all those feature vectors at each location over all the locations.
Because you have different feature
for each
features,
location. Yeah.
And for each location, you take the mean over the features?
No, you take the mean over all the locations.
Ah, for that specific feature.
Yeah.
Okay, and this goes
Correct.
to the LSTM.
So that's what is you see here.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You get a 1 by D vector, and then you concatenate them and pass to LSTM.
Okay. I think I got it. Uri, was it easier now for you? I think I understood.
Not 100%, but I'm converging.
That's a good word to use.
So is gating, just to understand this, gating is binary, like on off, and then attention is a scalar value?
It's not gonna be exactly, but what is it? Yeah. So it's a sigmoid. So basically, you convert. It's a scalar.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Okay. Any more questions, anybody? Let's see if we have something somewhere. No, we don't have. If no questions, do you guys want to take a 5-minute break? I know I would like it to get my focus back, and we'll start the second part if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So really, in 5 minutes, we're all getting back. I'll be back soon. So who do we have here? Shai, Uri, Sol. Anybody else who's still here? Write a bit about you. Where you're from? What are you doing with ML? Let us know. So here is a student. Human action detection. Soon is coming the time to start again. Is Philip here? Are you back? No? Good time to start. I wonder if there's a way to do like a bell, a Zoom bell. They have something like this? They should have. I can make, like artificially one. I can just like shout for a second and then everybody will hear, but should be something more fine than that. I'm gonna be talking funny stuff until Philip comes back. Ah, here you are. We don't see you, we don't hear you.
Can you still hear me?
We can hear you now, but not see you. Perfect. Now we see you. Ready when you are. We're past the 5 minutes. Everybody should have came back. Again, people, if you can, turn on your video, please. And use the audio when you have a question.
Okay, we're ready to start.
I'm muting. Go ahead.
All right. Well, yeah, so welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. I hope that you've enjoyed part one, and I will try to connect right to what Megmi already alluded to, and we will dig a bit deeper into some of those experiments. As before, feel free to interrupt at any time if you want some more clarification, something is clear. Yeah, so the work that I'm going to present here is what we did for this paper called When Pigs Fly, Contextual Reasoning in Synthetic and Natural Scenes. And here you can also see all our collaborators from the Crime Lab who contributed to this project. Now, to start off, I'd first like to make a link back to part 1. So I brought up once again those different experiments that we've looked at. And we can group those experiments into 2 cohorts. So we have the first set of experiments here, in which all of those experiments, in a way, were aimed at limiting context in some way or another. So you could do that in this very straightforward way of just limiting the area of the image that you expose. But you can also blur the image and therefore reduce the amount of information, the amount of contextual information that you provide. And finally, we've also seen that experiment where we use the filter. So again, restricting part of the contextual information that we provide. And then we have seen 2 experiments that were a bit different. They are in particular different because now we are not merely limiting the amount of context, but we are actually perturbing the context. So if we look at the jigsaw experiment again, we took those images and shuffled the image segments around. And by doing that, we violated those natural those spatial relationships between the objects. So the computer mouse, which used to be to the bottom right, perhaps, of the screen, this relation no longer holds in this experiment here. And if we look at the very right experiment, this incongruence experiment, we took that perturbation or violation even a step further by actually extracting an object in one image and pasting it onto a different image, in that case one with a totally unrelated context. So in part 2, we will look a bit more at context perturbations. And we will explore more here, especially along 2 ways. So first of all, as Mengmi has already mentioned, here we introduced quite a lot of artifacts. So in this jigsaw experiment, we did not merely mess up the object locations, but actually you can see that the entire scene is broken apart. So now we have objects that are cut in half, and the entire image doesn't really resemble a natural scene anymore. What's more, we also have those strong edges between image segments, so quite strong artifacts here. And on the right-hand side, you can also see some more subtle artifacts. So for instance, by just extracting an object from one image and pasting it into the other one, the lighting of the object is of course off. So the lighting of the computer mouse in this new scene here is no longer appropriate. And again, here we also have other artifacts like the boundaries of the object from the cutting and pasting. And finally, also something that brings us to the second road that we also want to explore here more. And that is that the size of the computer mouse is also no longer appropriate for this new scene. So the size of this mouse is in no way what we would expect it to be in proportion to the other objects in this scene. So the second thing that we want to explore more is this concept of context, and that also relates to a question that we got before. So now we would like to treat context as a more multidimensional concept, which has several aspects, and we would want to look at that in a more structured way, in a bit more fine-grained way. So especially those 2 things, the reduction of artifacts, and also this more fine-grained analysis of context. So therefore, the plan will be to start off with a short introduction, especially concerning a formalization of context, or some way how we can structure that a bit more, and that will be important for the rest of this talk. Then we will proceed to the OCD dataset, which we created here. OCD stands for out of context dataset, And that will address the 2 points which I tried to motivate before. Then we also have a new computational model here that will remind you in some ways of CRTNet, but I think we also have a few really interesting new design elements here, which are definitely worth talking about a bit. We will then bring those things together, look at the performance of CRTNet and a few baseline models on the different conditions in our OCD data set. And I'll conclude there. All right, so let us now take a step back and think again a bit more about a definition or a formalization of what context means. If you look into the literature, you will find that many authors have struggled with that task. They usually find it's very hard to come up with a comprehensive and rigorous definition. And two researchers, Alessandro Duranti and Charles Goodwin, they even wrote ones that we just might have to accept that such a definition doesn't even exist. But leaving a lot of those subtleties aside, it's nevertheless helpful to establish a few principles, a few ways how we thought it appropriate to think about context. So first of all, it makes sense to define context relative to a target. So in the image right here, we could take the computer mouse as our target object, and then we would count all the rest of the scene, including all of those other objects, as the context. And you see that we could, of course, just as well define the keyboard as the target object, and then the computer mouse would be part of the context. So this is a very simple but yet useful way to establish what is what. And once we have established what is part of the context and what is part or what is the target object, the thing that makes contextual information useful are actually relations. So think of it in the following way. When we engage in contextual reasoning, we're actually making use of the objects, the content of the context, and certain relations that connect them to the target object. So to give you some intuition here, we could say that the object that is much smaller than the screen, and that occurs together with the monitor and the keyboard, and is perhaps located right next to the keyboard and below the monitor, that object is much more likely to be a computer mouse rather than an elephant or a truck or any other object. So we can look at those relations, and here it is useful to look at the 5 relations for scene organization proposed by Biderman et al. A while ago. So those give us a very good starting point and a structure to organize different relations. So let us go through those 5 relations. We have, first of all, interposition. And by that, they mean that objects interrupt their backgrounds. So here we have this teacup, which partially occludes the teapot behind it. The second one is support. Here we expect the target object, the computer mouse, to rest on a surface, so perhaps on a desk. And it's definitely less likely to observe a computer mouse floating up here in the air. The third one would be co-occurrences, or how they originally called it in the paper, probabilities. And what is meant by that is that some objects are more likely to occur together than others are. So the computer mouse here again is quite likely to appear together with a keyboard and a monitor, but certainly less likely to appear together with an elephant. Then we have positions. Here we assume that objects do have one or several typical positions. For instance, the computer mouse again are located next to the keyboard, below the monitor, much rather than maybe over here. And finally, we also have size. And here we should think about relative size relations in particular. So the computer mouse is much smaller than the monitor, that kind of size relation. Okay, so let's keep that structure in mind and transition to the data set that we generated here. So as you know now, we are faced with quite a tricky task. We want to have a data set that provides us with a lot of diversity. In particular, we want to have a data set where we can play with those different relations. So it would be good to have a few images where we have huge objects in proportion to their surroundings. So for instance, a few huge cups or a few huge bottles. And at the same time, maybe a few objects that are floating in the room. While we are doing that, it should also be well controlled. So as I mentioned in the beginning, now we want to minimize the amount of artifacts that we are introducing here. And what's more, for this control aspect, we would also like to vary those different relations individually. So rather than what we had with this incongruence experiment from part 1, you might remember that there we pasted this computer mouse, and all of a sudden we changed the size of the mouse. It was very much too large for that new setting. And at the same time, the co-occurrences, it's a different of many different relations. And now we would like to tease those apart and vary one of those at a time as much as possible. And finally, it's of course always good to have a relatively large sample size as well. Now, if you take those things together, then you see that it's quite hard to come up with such a data set. Just going around in your house and taking pictures of floating objects is certainly not the most practical way of going about this. So what we thought to be an interesting approach here is the use of synthetic data. And let me therefore introduce you to the two main tools that we use to generate our data set. So we have on the left-hand side here, Unity, which is a graphics engine, which you're probably familiar with, especially if you play video games every now and then. And then on the right-hand side, we have Virtual Home. And Virtual Home is a framework that is based on Unity. And it comes with 7 fully furnished apartments, like the one that you can see here. Now, the great thing is that we have access to those apartments as 3D scenes. So we can actually go to Unity or use Virtual Home's API for some things to modify those scenes and modify all the objects in it. And that gives us exactly those properties that we need. So it gives us the freedom to translate objects, to lift objects up and make them float in the room, to scale them perhaps to change the relative sizes, and also to violate co-occurrences by placing objects in different rooms and different locations all over the apartment. At the same time, we can maintain a good level of control. And we have, of course, the possibility to generate as many of those images as we want, and perhaps also to easily add new experiments. So this is something that perhaps if someone else in the community is interested in, we're very happy to share our tools as well, such that new experiments or more images can be added to this data set. Okay, so let us now look at some of the images that we generated. We have grouped the images in our data set into 6 conditions. The first one of those is the normal context condition. So here we are reusing Virtual Home's default setting. We have all the objects in their typical positions, the normal sizes, everything is as you would expect it. If we now go to the gravity experiment, you can see that we lifted up the objects, the target objects. And therefore, if you think back to the relations in the beginning, we are playing with this support relation. The next experiment here is a co-occurrence experiment. So here we took objects, placed them in a totally different location, and what we mess up here are, of course, those co-occurrences. So the coffee machine, which used to be placed somewhere in the kitchen, and which occurred together with perhaps a few food items, and maybe the fridge and the stove, that is now located in the bathroom and surrounded by a bathtub and the washing machine.
I just wanted to remark that when I saw that, I immediately wanted to explain why. You know, like, oh, maybe there's a coder and he had to make a sandwich, and now he put his laptop or his keyboard in the kitchen. And so we can start to see like that there's this like tension between context, and that if there's too much tension, then you'd want to condition on some other information to make it even like reasonable. So it's like, I think that's pretty interesting how you do that.
Yeah, very interesting approach. Thanks for sharing that. Definitely, and I think that should be explored more as well. Maybe even a virtual home is a good place to start there, because those people are very much interested in how robots perhaps might interact with objects. So this is certainly a topic that would interest the authors of Virtual Home as well. So to continue on here, the next experiment is just a combination of the last two, so gravity plus co-occurrence now. And then we also have the size experiment. So here again, we should think about those relative sizes. So we now have an image of a computer mouse that is much larger in proportion to the screen or perhaps the keyboard next to it. And finally, we also created a no context experiment. This one is kind of an upgrade to the minimal context condition that we had in part one. So here we made use of another very nice side effect or benefit of using synthetic data, and that is that you can get pixel perfect object segmentation masks basically for free. So here we were really able to extract those objects and paste them onto a salt and pepper background. Okay, so let us now transition to the computational model. Here you can see a schema of the entire architecture of our context-aware recognition transformer network. And I'd like to go through this step by step. Of course, interrupt me at any time, such that maybe you can understand it. So just like with CRTNet, we are starting out again with two streams. So again, we have one stream that takes care of the context, and that has access to the entire image. And then we have a separate stream that takes care of the target object. And here we use the cropped image. So we create this part of the image by cropping the entire image to the bounding box of the target object. Okay, and we scale those input images to the same dimensions, such that just as in CRTNet, we have again a higher resolution of the target object in the target stream as compared to its resolution in the context stream. And as Magni mentioned already, that relates also to what we have in the human visual system in some way, since they're also the target object, or the object that you focus on, that will be represented on the retina, that is also represented by many more neurons in the visual cortex. So we encode both of those streams with convolutional neural networks. And then the next step is to tokenize the obtained feature maps. we tokenize those because, as you will see in the next step, we want to use a transformer decode. So we need those tokens. And what you can also see here is that we aggregated the entire feature map for the target object into one single token. So that is just kind of an arbitrary design decision here. For the tokenization, we follow the same approach as researchers at Google took here in the image transformer paper. So the idea is just to take the image, split it into patches, and then you use the features for each patch as one of the tokens. And you can augment those tokens with a positional encoding, which is often done. And in our case, we just added a standard learned positional encoding for each of those locations in the image. Okay, so once we have extracted the tokens, the core of the architecture now consists of a stack of transformer decoder layers. And those are meant to integrate the two streams. So since most of you are perhaps familiar with the original transformer architecture, I thought I'd bring that up here and we can contrast which part we are actually using here. For those who are not familiar with it, it should suffice to say here that we can think of the green and the blue parts here as two streams of information, and those are then combined via this multi-headed attention mechanism in the decoder part. Now, if we look at what we are using, the part in green now corresponds to our context tokens. So we did not use a transformer to extract those. We had the convolutional neural networks and then tokenized the feature maps. But that part, the context, will now make up the attention memory. And then in blue, we have the target token, which corresponds also to this part over here, perhaps. And the nice thing now with this transformer architecture, and especially the multi-head attention mechanism, is that we get a very natural way of querying the context dependent on the target object features. So that's what's happening inside each of those modules, and we have a few of those modules to hierarchically integrate contextual information into those target features.
Okay, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So if relations are so important, then why isn't there any, why not choose a kind of graphical network?
Good point, yeah.
Yeah, why not, yeah, kind of getting into that.
Sorry?
I just wanted to understand kind of why not, and maybe something here justifies it, or I'm not sure.
Sure, yeah. So graph neural networks have been used as well. One thing that I find to be a bit impractical there, that limits its use a bit, is that you have to get the graph first of all right. And oftentimes extracting a graph, a scene graph, for example, from an image is a very hard task. So if you want to do something like object recognition, you're probably facing the harder part of the task by first extracting the graph. And then once you have the graph, you can, of course, employ some graph neural network to reason there as well. So that is perhaps one of the reasons there.
Do you, let's say that you're interested in the relationship between two variables and you wanted to predict those, like that relationship strength, let's say that there's a keyboard in the kitchen now and versus a keyboard next to a mouse. And so you wanted to kind of measure that strength. Would you still be able to do that with this model?
Well, how do you mean that exactly? How would you want to? I'm not sure I'm following your argument there.
It's the prediction. So you predict the label is actually a graph. or you can say a joint, two objects instead of one. And so what you could do then is you could vary the input, right? Changing the scene, and then measure the strength of the predicted output, which is the relationship between those two objects. And this is just the reason why I think that might be useful is because essentially we're studying context, and context is relational. And so if you can't bake in the relations in the actual architecture, I was wondering with the graph, I was wondering if it's even this model is even capable of doing that without. We could take this offline, I feel like.
The graph neural network then, or are you talking about the model that we are proposing here?
I'm talking about simultaneously the architecture and the objective. So the objective right now is predict mug, and you're going to compare it across other objects. But I'm wondering, so if context is truly relational, then wouldn't you want to predict how it relates to other objects and have that be the objective? And I was wondering if you've done experiments doing that, and if this model can support that. It's kind of a two-part question, so
Okay.
I don't know.
That's very interesting. No, I'm afraid to say that we haven't done that yet. So hard to tell. I'd have to think a bit more about how you would incorporate that into the current architecture here. And perhaps also a graph neural network would be a more straightforward way then to go.
Can I add something here? So I think for graph neural network is a very good architecture, but the first question, as Philip has mentioned, is how do we define graph, right? Graph consists of edges and nodes. That's very good point that we could alter the edges, the strength of the edges. But the point is, how do we define nodes as the first place, right? How do you define objects, right? So if you are treating each object as a node in the graph, then what do you mean by object as the first place? Like if I'm giving you a tree and a person with a dog, like standing beside the person, how do you define the nodes here? Like, are you treating the leaf and the tree branches as individual nodes in the graph, or are you treating the entire tree as the graph? As the nodes in the graph, right? So it's just, as Philip mentioned, there have been lots of works on SandGraph, but the problem is you have to define you have to have a predefined set of object classes. Like, you know, this is a tree, this is a bench, or this is a street, this is the sky. But it's just, for me, it's hard to digest, or maybe it's just object parts instead of the entire objects that matter. So in that case, would you have subgraph as the input to the graph or something? Like, it's just not clear to me how are you going to use graph here, right? And then also the precondition for constructing the graph from an image is first you have to perform segmentation and object detection to extract those bounding blocks in order to get to the nodes. But the first question is, what are the nodes?
Yeah, good point.
And also one more point here. So I think the transformer itself has actually inherently represented this strength of edges, this notion of strength of edges somewhere in the transformer encoding layer by using different attentions, right? So since you have different multi-heads in this individual transformer encoding layer, and this attention actually denotes, like, you know, like maybe, you know, this is a person's head, and I should assign more attention to the person's body instead of his background or something, right? So I think the attention here, if I'm not exactly sure whether Philip has subsequent in the subsequent slides have all those visualization of attention maps, but I think that would actually tell us what are the relationships between different regions on the image. Yeah.
Very good points. So to continue on here, we left off with the transformer decoder modules here, which contextualized the information here. And after that, we can actually add a classifier and obtain an initial prediction that is now based on target and context information. Now, this is already a simplified version of our model, and we made one important addition to that for the following case. So here I'm showing another out of context image. What that means is that we have a coffee machine, again in the bathroom, next to a washing machine and 2 toothbrushes. And if you imagine now that we have a model that strongly relies on contextual information, then we would expect the model to be biased away or misled to make a false prediction here, because it just doesn't make sense that a coffee machine would appear in the bathroom. So wouldn't it be nice in this situation if the model could kind of fade out the background and concentrate here on the target object features? Because in this case, the target object features themselves seem to be quite defining. So you should be able to tell right away that this is actually a coffee machine. To make this a bit more precise, the intuition that we have here, and that intuition is actually backed by some of the results from the neuroscience literature, as well as some of our own results. The intuition is that contextual information is especially useful if the target object features alone are not sufficient. So if there is still quite a lot of uncertainty or ambiguity. So the computer mouse example might be quite good to illustrate that. If you're just looking at this object here, it's not immediately clear what the object would be. And here, of course, it helps a lot if you put it into the proper context, and you can actually now ambiguate between different hypotheses for this object that you might have had. On the other hand, if the if the target features tell you a lot already, and you're quite sure immediately what the object is, then the importance of context, but context is much less important in that case. And it can even mislead you, which has been shown as well in neuroscience studies. So we try to take that intuition and put it into the architecture as well. And the way we went about that is to add a second prediction here, right after the encoding stage of the target stream. So this classifier over here only has access to the target object features. It does not have access to the context stream. And along with this classification that we make here, and that is only based on target information, we also predict a confidence value. So this confidence value should indicate how confident the model is about this initial prediction. It should tell us if the model already thinks it knows what the object is, or if there is still a lot of uncertainty. And then once we have those two predictions, the one based on target and context information, and the one based on target information alone, we combine them in the following way. So we just take a weighted average here of those two predictions, and we weight them by this confidence estimate. So intuitively, if we get an example, say, for example, this the computer mouse from before, we would expect the confidence to be quite low at this time. And therefore, we would put a lot of weight on the contextualized prediction in the hope that the context around it might help and improve the prediction. On the other hand, if we have something like this coffee machine, and therefore quite a confident prediction right away, we would put more weight on this initial prediction and de-emphasize the importance of the context. So that mechanism should help the model to become more robust in situations of a misleading context, provided that the target features are actually sufficient to make a good classification. So that is how we obtain here the final prediction. So just as a quick recap at this point, we start off with two streams. We tokenize the obtained feature maps. We integrate those with a stack of transformer decoder layers, and we reach the first classification that way. And then we had this second confidence modulation part, which should help the model to become more robust in out of context situations. Okay, so now is a good time, I think, to look at some of those results. Firstly, we can look at the importance of contextual information again. So as I already alluded to earlier, this is perhaps a refined experiment, much like this minimal context experiment that we've seen in part 1. And what we found here for the 4 computational models that we looked at are very significant p-values, indicating that adding contextual information significantly improved the recognition accuracy. Now, let me tell you why I think this is a very well-controlled experiment. Because actually, for every target object in the normal context condition, we generated an analogous image in the no context condition. What that means is that the target object itself stays exactly the same. So it has the same position within the image, the same rotation, the same size, even the same lighting. And the only thing that changes is really that we use those pixel perfect object segmentation masks to replace the context with salt and pepper noise. And because we have such a very nice pairing between samples in one condition and samples in the other condition, we were able to use a paired permutation here, a paired permutation test here to obtain those p-values. So this emphasizes just once more that contextual information actually is helpful and can help computational models to improve their performance. Now, what we can look at next is how the models performed in those different perturbed contexts experiments. So what we have here now are accuracies of 2 models. On the left, we have CRTNet, and on the right, we have CRTNet. And we show their accuracies first in the normal context condition, and then across this perturbed context conditions. And we should take the normal context here as the reference point. If we do that, then we see that across all of those perturbed conditions, the recognition accuracy dropped. So if we interpret that, this seems to indicate that all of those aspects of context seem to contribute in some way. So models are able to leverage those different aspects of context and actually improve their predictions using them. Just a side note here for the gravity experiment, because in the meantime, we have run some more experiments, and we controlled here for the object pose in the gravity experiment. So the way we defined our gravity condition initially is that you just lift the object up and the camera position is kept fixed. So what you obtain then is a change in the object pose. And what we found is that if you control for that, so if you move the camera along and therefore preserve the same pose, then this drop is no longer significant here. So that is just to point out that sometimes it's very important how you define those experiments. And it's not to say that one way is the correct one or the other one. But this just uncovers what might be the main factor that plays into this gravity experiment here.
Another remark here, maybe also connecting to what Arthur mentioned, you use the confidence score from the, let's say, regular object classification network part as the weight, but actually putting here another calculation in the network that says, what is the confidence that the context is connected really to the object or not? So is it an in context object or not in context object? And using that as the weight, it's quite straightforward, I think, no? And if so, have you tried it? And if so, what were the results in comparison to this approach?
Okay, you mean if we have a different confidence metric, right?
So if the network not only predicts on the context part, not only predicts what is the class, but also how is the class related to the context, if it's in context or not.
Yeah, so that would be an alternative to the confidence value that you mean, right?
Yeah.
So the question there is how would you do that? How would you come up with such a measure?
So here you already have like data sets that are in context and not in context. And you define not in context as a size, gravity, and use that during training as the measure.
Okay.
Just a binary score.
Okay. I should really emphasize that.
Yeah.
Those are, again, only test sets. So the models were not trained on those test sets.
Okay. So maybe I missed that part.
What you're proposing is, of course, interesting. We could use that as a test set and then try to learn if something is in the appropriate context or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is definitely an interesting thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now the next thing here, and this is perhaps a bit puzzling. So at least I would have expected that one of those perturbations would be the most important one. So for instance, if you take away the co-occurrences and mess them up, then you would see the most dramatic drops in performance across all the models. And what our data seems to suggest now is that this is not really the case. So instead, we have quite a bit of heterogeneity across different models. And actually, if we look at those behavioral patterns, so to say, so here we have the accuracies for different models across the different context experiments, we can see that they are quite different. And this is also a point that runs through some more of our analysis, which I will not go into here. But we find that different computational models, tend to leverage different aspects of context, at least to different extents, for different object classes and different object sizes. So again, there's really quite a bit of heterogeneity here, and different model architectures seem to be more or less suited to leverage different aspects of context.
So quick question about the last slide. Do you mind if you go back?
That one?
Yeah, that one. Is the error bars, are they defined over the distribution over the training? I'm sorry, test set? Could you possibly fix the test set and then change how many times you have the distribution over different trained models? So the distribution is over the same model, but different trainings. And so you could see maybe where if there's a lot of variability within class.
So the ones that are here are, yeah, it's not what you're suggesting, but it's a good point. Yes, the training variability would of course be an interesting factor to look at here as well.
Yeah, then you could compare within class as well as yeah, because it could just be that this is settling in a different set point. You trained it once. I don't know. That's what happens.
Very good point. Very good.
And really, any conclusion about models needs to be about the distribution of models.
Mm-hmm.
So it should reflect that in the actual results.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a very good point. Thank you. Okay, well, here we just have the comparison of CRTNet versus the other baseline models. We were able to show here that it outperformed those models by quite a good margin in the normal context, and also in those perturbed context conditions. Here, sometimes by a larger margin, sometimes it's a bit closer, like here where we do have overlapping confidence intervals. I think I'll conclude here. So what I hope you will remember from this presentation is, first of all, that contextual information really matters. So if in the future you're working on another perhaps object recognition project or something related, think about incorporating contextual information unless you really have a good reason not to. And secondly, I hope I've broadened your intuition or your understanding of this concept of context a bit. We have seen that it is a very multidimensional concept and that its impact can be quite heterogeneous on different model architectures. Thank you very much. I think we can open for questions here.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Mengmi. Questions, anybody? I think like we got all the questions during, no?
I just wanted to kind of have a broader discussion about, I think a lot of work in context, and I could be totally wrong, feel free to correct me, but I feel like we're currently stuck on state, like everyone's talking about what's in the image. But I think what I got most from your talk is that, you know, we really should be thinking about the function, like what see context as a function. It's not a matter of state. It's like the sensitivity between the information and the target, and how much does the information predict the target. And so it could be summarized more as a function. And thinking about kind of the properties of that function would be really interesting. I don't know. That's just, I think that's like, for example, one specific property would be, I mean, this is kind of silly, but there's that tension. You know, when I saw that floating object, you know, it made me feel really weird. Like it shouldn't be there. And if there's a way to capture that, I think that's pretty important. Like things should be there, things shouldn't be there. There's tension in the visual representation of where objects are placed. And if you can capture that and say, okay, here's a spectrum of things with tension, and how do humans react in those scenarios? Like, what do they do? Do they make stories about the one with tension, like a ghost? You know, I think a ghost is something you can it's information you can dish on to make sense of a scene, or that the coder made a sandwich and that's why he put the keyboard in the kitchen. It's like there's tension there. We have to like relieve the tension. So we have to condition on additional information. So it's like, how does conditioning on extra information change tension between variables in what we call context? Something I get from your talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I think one view there is we're always trying to predict, right? To come up with explanation for the input that we get. And in those out of context examples, you have contradicting information, right? You have, on the one hand, you have the features of the object itself that tell you that should be the computer mouse, for instance. On the other hand, it just doesn't fit with the rest of the information, with the contextual information that we get. I'm not sure if I would say that context itself is the function. Perhaps that's more related to our reasoning process, or our perception, and perhaps what is in the neuroscience literature more this predictive coding notion. Yeah.
But like, it's a bit off topic, but thinking about this, there is, in our like human mind, there is a mapping between context and target to an emotion or to an explanation that you can define as a function, which context is part of its input. Yeah, that's for sure. And then like there's research now going on about taking a video or an image and creating a textual description on it, like a human readable textual description. So let's say you're taking out of context images, what type of description will be created there? And how do you train a network to create a description in that type of environment? But this is, that's a bit off topic for now, I think.
Yeah, I also want to add on something, like instead of the spatial context, it could also be temporal, as what you said, like it's a function in the sense that it could be memory or attention, right? Like how do you, what you have done previously, how do those memory would affect the way that you behave right now, right? Yeah, I definitely agree.
And we have another question by Sudhir. Don't particularly understand the idea of gravity as a context. The image might have been captured when some object is falling or thrown upwards by someone. Maybe I missed the discussion, but can I know why you chose that as a variable?
Mm-hmm. So I think here the motivation was really this support relation, so that objects tend to rest on a surface. Perhaps this example of an object that is just falling at the moment, that is of course a valid example, and then an object is in fact observed floating in the air. But those examples could also be seen as out of context example, in the sense that it's not the usual way how you encounter it, and therefore it's probably not a useful context for you to draw inference on the target object.
Okay, I think we've covered the questions and we also covered the time. So Philippe and Mengmi, thank you very much for today's talk. Again, this will be published with chapters on the recording and the reference. I think Mengmi, you sent us the reference about the adversarial attack paper. We will add it. And with this, I will say thanks everybody for joining, those who stayed the full time also. And I will see you next time in the next talk.
Thank you very much.
Nice meeting you guys. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.